If you're an American conservative, you know that the societal values we hold sacred are under attack. They are hanging in the balance. How can you protect those values? By staying informed. The closing argument will deliver news and supporting evidence you need to support and defend those values. Here's Paul Smith.
Good morning. This is Paul Smith, your host of The Closing Argument. In these podcasts, we discuss some of the important but controversial moral, political, and legal issues that affect us and our families today. Some of the things we discuss are not politically correct, and they may offend some of the listeners, but we must discuss them. These discussions will help us to preserve our liberties, to establish the truth, and to let the world know that there are many people who challenge some of the views that are gaining acceptance in our schools, our media, and our government, but which views are not proper. Today, we're going to talk about the recent Supreme Court case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization that was decided in late June 2022. This decision overturned Roe v. Wade. This decision, the Dobbs case, will go down in history as one of the most significant Supreme Court decisions of all time. Let me give you some background and information about what is going on right now, about a month after this decision came down. The Democrats have decried this case as a terrible case that took away women's rights. They depict it as a right-wing extremist opinion. They threaten the justices in various ways, including someone recently being arrested for attempting to kill Justice Kavanaugh. And they talk about wanting to pack the court with more justices so that they can change the viewpoint of the court. The Democrats have already been successful in characterizing this decision in negative ways and in ways that they hope will help them politically in the coming congressional elections that will take in November, 3 or 4 months from now. Frankly, the conservatives need to do the same thing in order to combat some of the efforts of the liberals. And I would suggest that this is how the Dobbs decision should be characterized. This decision corrected a terrible Supreme Court decision. It was good to recognize that the women have a right to control her body, but what they did is they extinguished the right of states to legislate in this area. The Supreme Court asserted itself as an unelected but superior legislature who would dictate laws to America. The Dobbs decision has restored democracy and democratic principles to America, and it leaves to the states and the people to determine the bounds of the woman's right to an abortion versus the fetal right to life. This was a great decision. Now, if you listen to the Democrat, mostly Democrat view on this, some of them are very effective in saying how terrible this was. Recently in Maryland, and I'm in the 6th District of Maryland, which was recently, its boundaries were redrawn so that we believe in the fall a Republican can be elected from this district. David Trone, a Democrat, is currently the representative from this district, and he's being challenged by a good friend of mine, Neil Parrott. Neil Parrott is a staunch right to life for the fetus supporter and a great legislator. And I think Neil will win it. It's going to be close, and I think he can win it. But what happened just 5 days ago, on Friday, July 22nd, David Trone convened some kind of congressional summit where he was joined with Senators Cardin and Van Hollen from Maryland, two Democrats like himself, and the Health and Human Services Secretary Becerra. And they had banners behind them basically being pro-abortion. And in this televised national symposium, they decried the Dobbs decision and called for new legislation to correct it, criticized the court, talked about perhaps packing the court. And they also talked about legislation. They want to pass congressional legislation that would codify Roe, meaning that they would give women the right to an absolute abortion until the point of viability, which is about 6 months into a pregnancy. But as I listened and watched this on TV, I was in New York at the time and happened to catch it on TV up there. One thing they do not talk about is the rights of the unborn children who are being aborted. They ignore them, treat them like they're nothing. And that was the problem with Roe. The Roe decision trampled on states' rights, established a law that they had no right to make. They violated the principles of stare decisis. In other words, they did not honor precedents. And before they recognized new rights that were not specified in the Constitution, they had an obligation to show that the right they were going to recognize had long been established in the history of our country, which was not the case with abortion right. So the Dobbs Case said that the Supreme Court had no authority to invalidate the Texas law, and they overturned it and returned the right to the states to determine the extent and bounds of the woman's right to privacy and versus the fetal right to life. Now, let me just mention a couple of things that the Supreme Court said, and I've plucked them out of the opinion, so you won't have to go through it. Regarding stare decisis, which is the court rule where the court is reluctant to overturn its precedents. And of course, Roe had been law for 49 years. So why didn't the court honor the principle of stare decisis? Well, the court said they did. This is what the court said. The stare decisis doctrine on which Roe and Casey's controlling opinion was found does not compel unending adherence to Roe's abuse of judicial authority. Roe was egregiously wrong from the start and from the beginning about a national consensus of the abortion issue. Roe and Casey have inflamed debate and deepened division. It's time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elective representatives. Now, what could be so bad about that, letting the people decide, huh? Now, the opinion, I'm getting into the weeds a little bit here, the opinion of the 5-judge majority, and it was a 5-4, 5-3 decision, I'll explain that. 6 judges voted to support the Mississippi law that would have prevented abortions after 15 weeks. Interestingly, Chief Justice Roberts agreed that the law was valid because he said the viability distinction really made no sense anyway, and he was ready to discard it. Now, the court had already discarded Roe's trimester scheme. That was done 20, 30 years ago. All that was left was this viability law, which had been totally created by the court. So Justice Roberts said, yes, the Mississippi law should be invalidated, but he didn't want to invalidate the Roe case. He did not want to overturn Roe, but he did agree in the overall decision. But the 5-judge majority based its ruling on saying, look, the rights created by Roe came through what is called the substantive due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And they said that requires that before you recognize a right that isn't enumerated, you have to show that it was deeply rooted in American history. And they said it was not, that the Supreme Court in 1973 disregarded that and was just egregiously wrong in doing that. But this Supreme Court still used that substantive due process analysis. Now, I mention that because Justice Thomas wishes the court would get rid of the substantive due process analysis. He said it's bad. We should get rid of it altogether. And I'll mention more about Justice Thomas later. Let me mention a couple of other quotes from the Supreme Court. They said this: precedents should be respected, but sometimes the court errs, and occasionally the court issues an important decision that is egregiously wrong. When that happens, stare decisis is not a straitjacket that prevents the court from correcting it. The court went on to say, we therefore hold that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. Roe and Casey must be overruled, and the authority to regulate abortion must be returned to the people and their elected representatives. Now, the court said this about Roe and Casey. Casey was a case that came 20 years after Roe that had some modifications in Roe, minor modifications. The court said that Roe and Casey imply that the Constitution does not permit the states to regard the destruction of potential life as a matter of any significance. And they pointed out that the dissent in the Dobbs case evinces no similar regard for a state's interest in protecting premortal life. So a couple of comments. Absolutely, the dissent in Dobbs and the Democratic Party today, they don't talk about the fetal right. They just ignore it as much as they can, and they'll hem-haw and just disregard it when the issue comes up. But half the country, if not more, don't feel that it's quite that simple, especially as a child approaches term and is ready to be delivered. To treat that child, unborn child, as if it has no rights is very repulsive to many people. It's just not right. There's something in us that recognizes the killing of that life is just something that's wrong. It just, except in extreme circumstances that justify it, such as the health of the mother or her life being endangered by it, you don't lightly just extinguish that life. Now, the court was really nice to the dissenters in this case, because they said Roe implies that the Constitution doesn't permit states to regard the potential human life as of any significance. Well, frankly, what the Supreme Court did is they said there is no, that a fetus is not a person within the meaning of the Constitution. Well, that's pretty bad, and that differed with what the states had done. Why the court says that Roe implied this, I don't know. The court in Roe specifically destroyed the fetal right to life by that language. And that was egregious, in my opinion. And so the court has corrected it. So now, where does the fetal right to life stand? Depends upon the states. Full authority, apparently. Now, whether it's full, I don't know, because I think the court would then have to balance the woman's right to control her body with a fetal right to life. How they would do that, I don't know. But the absolute destruction of the fetal right to life that the Supreme Court did in Roe is now over. That has been overturned. A couple of other things about Roe and about what Dobbs did. Now, here's what the court did in Dobbs. The Supreme Court, they said the Supreme Court does not have the power or authority to override states in the area of fetal rights and abortion. Said the Supreme Court should not have invalidated the Texas law. The Supreme Court honors federalism, which allows different states to have different rights and different resolution to these issues. Dobbs stands for the fact that the Supreme Court should not have even taken the case in 1973. They should have exercised judicial restraint. And the Supreme Court in Dobbs basically is saying that the Supreme Court is not supposed to be a super legislature, which basically becomes a dictatorship. It is not democratic and violates democratic principles. And they said it was wrong in doing so. And with regard to the right of a woman to control her body that was recognized in Roe, that right was, in essence, is still there. The Supreme Court did not say there is no such right, but they left it to the states and the elected representatives to determine